You think you know Henry VIII, the king with 6 wives who founded the Church of England? But what if I told you the real Henry VIII was a psychological predator who turned marriage into a form of elaborate torture? A man so twisted that he didn't just execute his wives, he orchestrated their mental destruction first, making them watch as innocent people died because of his paranoid fantasies. Let's start with Anne Boleyn, because her story reveals the true monster behind the crown. Before Henry decided to kill her, he didn't just lose interest or find someone new. He methodically destroyed her psyche in ways that would make modern serial killers take notes. Henry forced Anne's own musician to confess under torture to having an affair with her. But here's the truly sick part. He made Anne watch as 5 men, including her own brother George, were executed for allegedly sleeping with her. Picture this scene. Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, standing in a palace window as her brother's head was severed from his body. She had to watch 5 innocent people die knowing she was next, knowing her husband had orchestrated this entire nightmare because his paranoid mind had convinced him she was unfaithful. The psychological torture was deliberate. Henry wanted Anne to understand that he had the power to kill anyone, even her own family, based on nothing more than his suspicions. But Anne wasn't his only victim. Catherine Howard got it even worse, and she was barely more than a teenager when Henry married her. When he discovered her past relationships, not affairs during their marriage, but relationships she'd had before she even knew him, he didn't just execute her. He changed the entire legal system of England. Henry passed a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their complete sexual history. Imagine being so petty that you alter your nation's laws because your teenage wife wasn't a virgin. The psychological games were the worst part. Henry would shower his wives with gifts and affection one day, then completely ignore them or threaten them the next. Catherine of Aragon spent her final years essentially under house arrest, forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary, while Henry spread rumors that she was mentally ill. She died alone, possibly poisoned, writing letters to Henry that he never bothered to read. Here's something that will blow your mind. Henry actually forced his wives to sign documents agreeing to their own divorces or annulments. Anne of Cleves was so terrified of him that she agreed to a fake marriage annulment just to avoid execution. She basically had to pretend their marriage never happened and thank him for the privilege of not being murdered. And Jane Seymour, the lucky one who died of natural causes. She died from complications after giving birth to Henry's son, and Henry was already eyeing up his next wife before Jane's body was even cold. He waited exactly 9 days after her funeral to start planning his next marriage. The man treated human beings like disposable objects. But wait, it gets worse. These women had absolutely no escape. Divorce wasn't an option. Running away meant death. And fighting back meant not just your own execution, but potentially your entire family's destruction. Henry had created a system where his wives were trapped in a nightmare with no way out, except death. By the end of his life, Henry VIII wasn't just cruel. He was literally a walking corpse. We're talking about a man whose body had become so grotesque that even his own servants were traumatized by the sight and smell of him. Henry's waist measured 54 inches. To put that in perspective, that's bigger than most people are tall. He weighed around 400 pounds in an era when the average man weighed maybe 140. But here's the truly horrifying part. It wasn't just obesity. His legs were covered in festering open wounds that never healed. These weren't small cuts. We're talking about massive ulcers that oozed pus and rotted flesh continuously. The smell was so overwhelming that courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when approaching the king. Some historical accounts describe the stench as being detectable from several rooms away. Servants actually drew straws to determine who had to help dress him, because getting close to those wounds was considered a form of punishment. The smell wasn't just bad, it was the smell of death, of living flesh rotting while the person was still alive. Imagine having to wake up every morning and approach a king whose body was literally decomposing around him. Modern medical experts believe Henry suffered from a severe traumatic brain injury from a jousting accident in 1536. This wasn't just a bump on the head. He was unconscious for 2 hours, which in medieval terms meant he was practically dead. The injury likely caused massive personality changes, explaining his transformation from a relatively normal young king into the paranoid, rage-filled monster of his later years. But the brain injury was just the beginning. Henry also probably had a condition called Cushing's syndrome, which would explain his dramatic weight gain, mood swings, and those horrific leg ulcers that refused to heal. His own doctors were so terrified of him that they wouldn't dare suggest he might be seriously ill. Criticizing the king's health was considered treason. The man who claimed divine right to rule couldn't even control his own bowel movements in his final years. Royal attendants had to carry special chairs everywhere he went, because Henry could barely make it from room to room without having an accident. Palace records describe servants following behind him with cloths to clean up bodily fluids that would leak from his failing body. His eating became even more grotesque as his condition worsened. Henry consumed roughly 5,000 calories per day, more than double what an active adult male should eat. And remember, this guy could barely walk by the end of his life. A typical meal included an entire roasted pig, multiple whole chickens, several types of fish, mountains of bread, and enough wine to float a small boat. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Henry was convinced that certain foods had magical properties. He believed eating swan would make him more graceful, consuming large amounts of deer would make him a better hunter, and that oysters would enhance his performance with his wives. So he'd gorge himself on these specific foods in massive quantities, like some kind of medieval superfood obsession, all while his body was literally falling apart. The most disturbing part? Even as pieces of rotting flesh would fall off his body, Henry kept eating more and more, convinced that his royal status somehow made him immune to the consequences of his gluttony. The king who executed people for looking at him wrong couldn't even look at himself without seeing a monster. Henry VII's paranoia wasn't just your typical trust no one attitude. This man turned his entire kingdom into a surveillance state that would make modern dictators jealous. By his final years, Henry was so convinced that everyone was plotting against him that he transformed royal life into a living nightmare for everyone around him. Let's start with his sleeping arrangements, because they reveal just how far his mind had deteriorated. Henry slept with loaded crossbows next to his bed and kept multiple daggers under his pillow. But that wasn't enough. He also had armed guards stationed inside his bedroom, watching him sleep all night. Imagine being so terrified of assassination that you couldn't even close your eyes without witnesses. The palace itself became a fortress of paranoia. Henry ordered the construction of secret passages throughout every building he lived in, not for romance or convenience, but so he could escape if assassins came for him. He had peepholes installed in walls so he could spy on his own courtiers and listening devices hidden in meeting rooms to eavesdrop on private conversations. But here's where it gets truly insane. Henry created an entire network of spies whose job was to spy on his other spies. He had informants watching his informants, creating this twisted web of surveillance where nobody knew who they could trust. Court life became a psychological horror show where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could literally get you executed. The most disturbing aspect was how he treated his own children. Henry had spies watching Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters, because he was convinced they were planning to overthrow him. These were children, and he treated them like enemy agents in their own home. Palace records show servants reporting on what the princesses said in private, what books they read, even their facial expressions during meals. Henry's food paranoia reached absolutely ridiculous levels. Not only did he have multiple food tasters, but he required his meals to be prepared in completely sealed kitchens, with guards watching every step of the cooking process. The salt, the spices, even the water had to be tested by different people. He was so convinced someone would poison him that eating a simple meal became a military operation. But the paranoia got so extreme that Henry started executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed yet. He'd have someone killed because he dreamed they betrayed him, or because someone else suggested they might be disloyal in the future. The Tower of London was constantly full of people whose only crime was existing near Henry while he was in one of his paranoid moods. Here's what's truly terrifying. Henry's paranoia was so contagious that it infected his entire court. Nobles started spying on each other. Servants betrayed their masters for imaginary rewards, and everyone lived in constant fear that they'd be the next victim of the king's delusional suspicions. The royal court, once a place of culture and refinement, became a madhouse where survival meant never trusting anyone, not even your closest friends. The man who claimed to rule by divine right had turned his kingdom into a prison where he was both the warden and the most tortured prisoner. And the worst part? His paranoia was completely justified. Not because people were actually plotting against him, but because his behavior had become so monstrous that everyone around him was genuinely terrified of what he might do next. If you think competitive eating is crazy today, wait until you hear about Henry VIII's daily food consumption rituals. This man didn't just eat like a king, he ate like he was trying to single-handedly cause a famine, all while turning every meal into a theatrical performance that lasted for hours. Henry's kitchen staff prepared over 800 different dishes every single day just for his household, with Henry personally sampling dozens of them. The royal kitchens employed over 200 people working around the clock to keep up with his appetite. But the sheer quantity wasn't even the weirdest part. It was the elaborate security theater that surrounded every single bite. Every piece of food that entered Henry's mouth was first tasted by multiple servants to check for poison. But get this. He was so paranoid that he required his food tasters to wait 30 minutes after eating before he'd touch anything, just to make sure they didn't drop dead from delayed-acting poison. Imagine being so suspicious that you turned eating into a 30-minute waiting game with human guinea pigs. Henry's meals were basically theatrical performances held in front of hundreds of courtiers, and the whole process could take up to 4 hours. Picture sitting there watching this massive, rotting king slowly work his way through enough food to feed a small village, all while pretending this was perfectly normal royal behavior. The smell from his festering leg wounds mixed with the aroma of roasted meats created an atmosphere that was both luxurious and nauseating. But here's where his eating habits became truly bizarre. Henry actually banned certain foods from his court, not because they were unhealthy, but because he thought they were beneath his royal status. Common people's food like turnips and barley were literally illegal at his table, even though they probably would have been better for his health than the mountains of meat and sugar he consumed daily. The man also had the strangest food superstitions. He believed that consuming the hearts of certain animals would give him their courage, that eating specific fish would improve his memory, and that different spices could control his mood. So meals became elaborate attempts at magical transformation, with Henry gorging himself on particular ingredients based on what personality traits he wanted to enhance that day. Henry's wine consumption was equally excessive. He could drink enough in one sitting to incapacitate several normal men, yet somehow remained functional enough to make life-or-death decisions about his subjects. Palace servants had to keep detailed records of exactly which wines he consumed and in what quantities, because Henry was convinced that certain vintages had medicinal properties. The most pathetic part was that even as his body was literally falling apart from his diet, Henry kept eating more and more, convinced that his royal status somehow made him immune to the consequences of his gluttony. He'd developed a fantasy that kings had different digestive systems than common people, that royal blood could process unlimited amounts of food without consequence, but the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Servants would find Henry passed out at the dinner table, having gorged himself into unconsciousness. Other times, he'd become so violently ill from overeating that palace physicians feared he might die from digestive complications. Yet the next day, he'd demand another elaborate feast, trapped in a cycle of compulsive consumption that was slowly killing him from the inside out. By his final years, Henry VIII had become something that barely qualified as human. The king who once danced until dawn and jousted with the best knights in Europe now needed mechanical devices just to move from room to room. But the most horrifying part wasn't his physical decay. It was how everyone around him had to pretend this shambling corpse was still the mighty King of England. Henry was so massive that he couldn't walk, so his servants had to carry him everywhere using a specially designed chair with pulleys and wheels. But here's the disgusting part. His leg wounds had become so infected that pieces of rotting flesh would literally fall off his body as they moved him. Servants had to follow behind him with cloths to clean up the chunks of decomposing king that dropped on the palace floors. The smell had become so overwhelming that even approaching Henry's chambers required preparation. Courtiers would soak handkerchiefs in perfume and hold them to their faces, but even that wasn't enough to mask the stench of living death that surrounded the king. Some visitors to the palace reported that they could smell Henry's presence 3 rooms away, a combination of rotting flesh, infected wounds, and the various ointments his physicians desperately applied to try to slow his decay. His mental state had deteriorated along with his body. Palace servants reported that Henry would have conversations with people who weren't there, sometimes becoming enraged at invisible enemies or laughing at private jokes that made no sense to anyone else. The traumatic brain injury from his jousting accident had finally caught up with him, turning his mind into a maze of paranoid delusions and childish outbursts. But perhaps most pathetic of all was how Henry still insisted on maintaining royal protocol. Even as his body was falling apart, he demanded that courtiers treat him with the same ceremony and respect as always. Picture this grotesque scene. Nobles having to kneel before a man whose flesh was literally rotting off his bones, pretending to seek wisdom from someone whose mind had clearly snapped. The courtiers had become prisoners of their own politeness. Nobody dared acknowledge what everyone could see, that their king was dying in the most disgusting way possible. They had to conduct serious political business with a man who could barely stay conscious for more than an hour at a time, whose body odor was so powerful it made people physically ill. Henry's physicians were trapped in an impossible situation. They knew he was dying, but suggesting that the king was seriously ill was still considered treason, so they had to pretend that his condition was improving even as they watched him decompose before their eyes. Medical records from the period show doctors prescribing increasingly desperate treatments, bloodletting, herbal poultices, even experimental surgeries, all while knowing that nothing could save a body that had decayed this far. The most disturbing part was that Henry seemed partially aware of his own condition, but his damaged mind couldn't process it properly. He'd sometimes look down at his own body with confusion, as if surprised to find himself trapped in this rotting shell. Other times, he'd insist that his health was perfect and threaten anyone who suggested otherwise. In his final weeks, Henry had to be fed like a child because he could no longer coordinate the movements necessary to eat properly. The king, who had once consumed elaborate feasts, now struggled to swallow simple broths without choking. Yet even in this pathetic state, he maintained his paranoia about poison, insisting that every spoonful be tasted first by his increasingly nauseated servants. You'd think Henry VIII's reign of terror would end with his death, but this man was so committed to causing chaos that even his corpse managed to create absolute mayhem. What happened to his body after death was so grotesque that it seemed like nature itself was getting revenge on England's most monstrous king. When Henry finally died in January 1547, nobody wanted to get close enough to officially confirm he was dead. His body had swollen to such grotesque proportions that his skin was stretched tight and shiny, like an overfilled balloon. The smell was so overwhelming that even his doctors, who were used to medieval medical horrors, had to leave the room to vomit. But the real nightmare was just beginning. Henry's body was so bloated with gases from internal decomposition that his coffin had to be specially reinforced with lead sheets. They wrapped his corpse in multiple layers and sealed it in what they thought was an impenetrable wooden box. They were very, very wrong. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, something absolutely incredible happened. The coffin literally exploded. The gases from Henry's decomposing body built up so much pressure that the lead lining burst open, and rotting royal remains splattered all over the inside of the hearse. The smell was so horrific that the funeral procession had to stop while servants cleaned up the mess with buckets and rags. Here's a detail that will haunt your nightmares. Dogs were reportedly seen licking up the remains of Henry VIII that had leaked from his coffin onto the road. The man who claimed to rule by divine right ended up as dog food on a country highway. Even death couldn't contain the chaos he had spent his life creating. But wait, it gets worse. They had to dig his grave extra wide to accommodate the massive coffin, but the ground kept collapsing because the soil couldn't support the weight of all that lead and rotting flesh. It took multiple attempts just to get the king's remains into the ground and keep them there. The chaos didn't end with his burial. For years afterward, people reported strange noises and terrible smells coming from Henry's tomb. Some claimed it was his ghost, but historians think it was probably just more gases escaping from his continuously decomposing remains. The man couldn't even stay quiet in death. Here's something that will blow your mind. Several of the servants who handled Henry's body during the funeral preparations died within weeks, possibly from infections they caught from contact with his rotting corpse. Even in death, Henry VIII was still killing people. But perhaps most shocking of all was what they found when they eventually opened his tomb centuries later. His body had decomposed so completely that there was almost nothing left, just a few bone fragments and some metallic residue from all the treatments his physicians had tried. The man who had terrorized Europe for nearly 4 decades had been reduced to practically nothing, as if his body had been so toxic that even death wanted nothing to do with it. The autopsy reports that survived from the period described organs so malformed and diseased that it seemed impossible he had lived as long as he did. His heart was described as no larger than a walnut, shriveled and blackened. His intestines were described as putrefied and gangrenous, essentially rotting inside his body while he was still alive. So there you have it, the real Henry VIII. Not the charismatic king of popular culture, but a walking disaster whose own body betrayed him as dramatically as he betrayed everyone around him. A man so consumed by paranoia and gluttony that he turned one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms into his personal horror show. Even death couldn't end his capacity for causing absolute chaos. His legacy isn't just the Church of England or his 6 wives. It's a masterclass in how absolute power can turn a human being into something genuinely monstrous, something so toxic that even the grave couldn't contain it.